So first up, thank you for inviting me to speak today. First, I thought I'd give you a report card, if you like, on the SMSF sector from our point of view. Then I thought I'd talk about the issues that we will focus on for our compliance activities over the coming year, as well as touching on some other issues of concern to us as the regulator. And I also thought I'd run through some of the help and assistance that we offer to SMSF professionals and trustees. So first, the report card. And by that, I mean a few things around what our statistics are telling us about the growth and the shape of the SMSF sector. Okay, during the past 4 years, the number of SMSFs has grown rapidly. As at the end of June 2013, there were just over an estimated 509,000 funds, with an increase of about 40,000 funds in 1 year alone. So that's fairly fast growth. The assets under management in the SMSF sector has grown to approximately $506 billion, which is holding steady at about a third of the now around $1.6 trillion held in Australian superannuation. The establishment of new funds has far outpaced wind-ups. Of SMSFs established in the 10 years to June 2011, 90% are still operating. And the number of people who are members of SMSFs is approaching 1 million, sitting at around 960,000 at the moment. Now that's 8% of the 11.6 million members of Australian superannuation funds. So we haven't hit that magic 1 million yet, but we'll probably get there shortly. Now, there's about 1 million Australians also changed superannuation funds in the last year, and 6% of those moved to an SMSF. As one analyst said, commenting on this trend, it's a one-way valve. Once members start an SMSF, they rarely ever go back. Now, while on average SMSF members have tended to be older than members of APRA-regulated funds, there's been a recent trend to members of new SMSFs being younger than the general SMSF member population. In other words, while most members of SMSFs are over 45, there's an increasing number of new members who are in the 25 to 44 age group. And an interesting thing about that is it's more women than men in that age group that we're seeing. Now, it's only an early and new trend, and it's a slight difference, but it'll be very interesting to see where it goes over the next few years. Now, particularly because one of the things from our perspective is, in relation to superannuation generally, is actually trying to get young people interested in superannuation. Because usually, money, I'm going to spend that. 25, who cares? That's about when you're 65, I'll be dead by then. So if you suddenly get people actually jumping into self-managed super funds at 25, there's something very interesting going on there. As an aside, I wonder if that's something to do with the differences with the Gen Y and younger ones. The way they seem to be commented on as being a little different from Gen X and older. Anyway, so members of SMSFs have also generally had higher average balances, and they generally also have a higher taxable income than the members of APRA-regulated funds. And return on SMSF assets as a whole in 2011 was 7.7%, and for APRA funds it was 7.8%, so it's very close. Also, the increasing popularity of SMSFs has, as you've undoubtedly noticed, brought more public commentary on the whole SMSF sector. There's been quite a bit of questioning around the health of the sector. But from our perspective, with every fund required to be audited by an independent approved auditor every year, and those auditors only lodging contravention reports with us for around 2% of funds a year, we think it's actually a sector that's in pretty good shape. That's a very small number, 2%. However, we are concerned that the number of funds that lodge their annual return late, and that's something I'm going to touch on later, might indicate that there's actually some other issues around. Now, the resilience of the SMSF sector is also in part shown by how well it weathered the storm of the global financial crisis. While our stats show that the SMSF sector as a whole had negative return on assets during that period, APRA-regulated funds as a whole had slightly larger negative return on assets in that period. Our stats also show the SMSF sector recovered in the following 2 years with positive returns in 2010 and 2011, and those positive returns were pretty much around the same rate as the APRA regulated funds as well. We also saw continuing growth through the GFC, albeit at a slower rate, in the number of SMSFs, and it returned to the higher rates of growth in the number of SMSFs very shortly after the GFC. So from 2009 to 2013, the number of SMSFs grew by 27%. So from just under 400,000 funds to that 509,000 or thereabouts funds I mentioned earlier. So that's 27% in 4 years. That's quite incredible. Okay, we also saw continuing growth, albeit at a slower rate, in the number of SMSFs during the GFC, as I said, much faster afterwards. Anyway, that's all the stats I wanted to cover. I think you've probably been bored enough by then. Now, if you are actually interested in stats, we do publish stats quarterly and annually with reports on the sector as a whole, and the statistical report for the 2011-12 year is going to be published sometime in November. You're also probably wondering why it's for the 2011-12 year and we're in 2013. Yes. It's based on return data, and so we only get returns after the end of the year, and you've got a lag between when the returns trickle in and therefore when we do the data. Okay. So, now I'm going to start talking a bit about our compliance activities now. And the stats that I've discussed show that it's in pretty good shape. You know, there's always going to be a few issues. So first I thought I might just say, at a general level, the kinds of things that we worry about before getting into what we do about them. So what concerns us as the regulator, and what I'm sure kept Stuart awake at night, and is probably going to keep me awake at night, thanks Stuart, is that we worry about trustees or SMSF professionals who don't understand their obligations. We worry about trustees who fail to comply with their obligations. We worry about approved auditors who don't audit funds properly and don't report contraventions to us as they should. We worry about SMSFs being deliberately misused, such as being set up for illegal early release, or the money in the fund being accessed early before a condition of release is met, or the SMSF being used for tax avoidance. Now, before I get into things we're doing about the things that worry us, I do want to emphasise that a very large majority of funds do meet their obligations, and it's the very large majority who meet their obligations, and we'll also continue to help them to do so so that we can actually focus on those who don't comply, whether deliberately or in error. And I also want to emphasise that to the extent that we can within the limits of the law, we respond differently to non-compliance, depending on what rules have been breached and what behaviour we see. So, what are we doing this year? We're focused on engaging with new trustees to ensure they can operate their SMSF and are not seeking illegal early access to their retirement benefits. We're focusing on ensuring annual returns are lodged and lodged on time. For new funds, we're also focusing on whether they're entitled to receive their notice of compliance. We're reviewing irregularities in exempt current pension income in non-arm's length transactions. The re-reporting of contributions and compliance with excess contributions tax release authorities is also going to get some of our attention. And this year we'll be looking more closely at every fund reported to us by SMSF approved auditors. We want to make those trustees more fully aware of their obligations and to ensure the contraventions are dealt with appropriately. Now, we're all fortunate that every fund must be independently audited annually for regulatory compliance, and reportable contraventions must be reported to the tax office. This independent audit is a critical factor in the ongoing concessional tax treatment of SMSFs, satisfying the government and the community that SMSFs are meeting their obligations. These audits also inform the ATO about SMSFs at risk and allow us to engage early with them. As I mentioned earlier, over the past few years, the proportion of SMSFs reported to us for contraventions remains steady at around 2%. However, in the last year, so that's the 2012 to 13 year, there has been a drop in the number of funds reported to us through the contravention report. Now, I really hope that this is because the levels of understanding and compliance in the sector have improved, but it might just be because there's some kind of lag in the data and we'll get an increase later, or it might be that there's a decrease in the effectiveness of the audits. Now, I don't think it's the latter. I think that's highly unlikely. And I certainly hope it's the first one, that it's an increase in understanding. But given the importance of the audits to us, we'll be looking to analyse the reasons quite closely and deal with it if we see a problem. And we also, on top of auditors, we also review the compliance and effectiveness of auditors. Now they have to be, now that approved auditors have to be registered with ASIC, it's going to be ATO and ASIC together who will be keeping an eye on approved auditors. So it's not just us anymore. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But first, we're going to talk about trustees and compliance. So what we're doing about trustees and compliance. Now, again, I want to emphasise that in the main, trustees, as far as we can see, are attempting to comply with their obligations and are doing so successfully. However, we do actually find a worrying number of trustees who have little or no understanding of their obligations and appear to have assumed that their agent or accountant will take all responsibility. While many advisors and tax agents will ensure that trustees meet their obligations, it's important for trustees to recognise that they themselves are the ones who are accountable. We also find reasonable numbers of trustees who don't fully understand aspects of their obligations, and this has led them to reporting incorrectly on their annual return while having a contravention reported to us. We find a small number of trustees who appear to be taking inappropriate actions without any attempt to comply, but it's only a small number, I emphasise that, or even intending not to comply. Now, obviously those ones are the ones where we take the firmest action. So are there any areas where we commonly see problems? Well, yes, there are. Again, when I say commonly see problems, it's in the minority of cases where there actually is a problem. So what are the common areas? Exempt current pension income. This is a major tax concession for funds available during the pension phase. It allows income earned by the fund that supports the pension to be free from income tax. As more SMSFs convert to the pension phase, we expect to see more income exempt from tax. However, we found that many trustees are failing to calculate it correctly, especially with carry forward losses and apportioning of expenses. So that's just something to be careful about. Now, while I'm talking about exempt current pension income, I might just mention that we have recently published a Q&A document on our website, which highlights the conditions that must be met to allow an SMSF paying a pension to continue to claim exempt current pension income where the minimum pension payments haven't been met. I encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already, particularly if you are a trustee of a fund in pension phase. Now, while I mentioned minimum pensions, trustees should also ensure that they at least pay the minimum pension, because otherwise the income supporting the pension loses its exemption from income tax. Okay, the second common problem area is about non-arm's length income, or NALI. That was one of the things that Stuart said to me in the first couple of weeks. He said he wanted to talk about NALI, and I said, what on earth is that? He then apologised for using an acronym. So, either way, I think my second week somebody handed me an A3 in 10-point font which listed all the super acronyms. I haven't learned it all yet. Anyway, some funds don't report NALI correctly and do not pay the correct amount of tax. So again, that's something to watch out for. One of the other things to note around NALI is that we do have a tax ruling out about that, which is Taxation Ruling 2006/7. That sets out our view around what NALI is. There's also been a few court cases around special income and NALI in the last couple of years, and they have generally supported our views. Okay. Last common problem I'll mention is that of trustees investing in or transacting with related parties in breach of the rules. This can be by providing a loan or other financial assistance to a member or relative, and this is something you can't do. It's also common that when there is a loan to a member, that doesn't actually meet the characteristics of a genuine loan anyway, and is actually early access to the funds. If it is early access, well, that gives you very adverse tax results. Now, the breaches most commonly reported to us by SMSF-approved auditors are breaches of the lending and financial assistance rules or the in-house asset rules. So again, that's just an area to pay attention to. So in addition to these common problem areas, another of our focuses this year is on the lodgement of the SMSF annual return. Now, you've heard me mention this several times, so it's clearly something I'm getting obsessed about. So now I'm going to indulge in that obsession a little bit right now. So, one of the key trustee obligations which we're concerned about this year is lodgement of the return. The return reports on the fund's regulatory and income tax obligations, and that's why you have to do it every year. And that's why it needs to be on time. Now, we also consider that timely lodgement is actually a clear indicator of how well a fund is run. And this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, to be able to lodge the annual return, the fund has to have been audited. So, the annual independent audit is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the key regulatory requirements. Failure to lodge the return suggests the fund is not being audited. And this in turn makes one wonder what the fund has to hide that it doesn't want audited and doesn't want us to know about. Also, if that's not the case, if the fund can't get through the task of doing its annual return, it does make one wonder what else they can't do and aren't managing properly in accordance with the rules. So, from our point of view, failure to lodge the return or extended delays in lodging the return is an indicator of higher compliance risk. That's why we're trying to focus on getting returns in. So this year we are planning on getting tougher with poor lodgers. All SMSFs with 2 or more years of overdue lodgements will have their regulation details removed from super fund lookup. APRA funds will not generally do rollovers into SMSFs unless their details are on super fund lookup. Some employers even look at super fund lookup before making contributions to SMSFs. So, if we have removed the fund's details from super fund lookup, then that's going to affect rollovers and potentially affect contributions. And we're going to keep those details off super fund lookup until the lodgements are up to date. We're also reviewing around 18,000 funds which have either continually failed to lodge or we believe are inactive. And we're going to encourage those funds to wind up. Now, we also recognise that poor lodgement behaviour is something that can start early. So we're working even more closely with newly registered SMSFs to make sure they understand their obligations and encourage on-time lodgement from the start. We're also tightening up our processes that allow for a return not necessary indicator. Now we've generally given that out in the first year when the fund's just set up, hasn't got assets yet, so forth and so on. Just to say, well, there's nothing to report, so no need to report. But what we've been finding is quite a few funds who come back to us the next year and ask for it again. Now, there's also a few, by the way, who come back to us for a third year. You've got to really say, if the reason you're saying you don't need to lodge a return is you haven't got any assets, so there's nothing to report to us, have you got a fund? And if you haven't got a fund, why have we got you in the register? So, for that lot, we're going to give them for the first year, and for the ones who are on our books as having got one for a second or more, we'll be looking to get them linked up too. Because you've got to say, there isn't an SMSF there. Alright, I think I've indulged my obsession about on-time lodgement enough. So, let's move on to something else. Now, earlier I mentioned that one of the other things that keeps Stuart, now me, awake at night, is around potential for tax avoidance and the deliberate misuse of SMSFs. So I just thought I might briefly mention some of the avoidance schemes we've been seeing in the last year. So one scheme involved a share trading strategy to enable a taxpayer to access double franking credits attached to fully franked dividends where the taxpayer effectively only held one parcel of shares. That's a neat trick. We also saw some new variations in the dividend access share arrangement, which was referred to in our Taxpayer Alert 2012/4 and Draft Taxation Determination 2013/D5, involving the disposal of shares in a related private company which had substantial retained profits and franking credits where they disposed the company to the SMSF. And they do a few neat little other tricks after that point. I won't go into details. From time to time, we still also come across the SMSF joint venture arrangement, which is described in our Taxpayer Alert 2009/16. And that one tries to circumvent the in-house asset rules by using related party agreements. And lastly, we're currently getting quite interested in the arrangements involving holiday travel claimed as an investment expense by SMSF trustees. That's something we're currently taking a close look at. Further on tax avoidance, we put a lot of information around tax avoidance on the tax planning part of our website. From our point of view, recognising, rejecting and reporting tax avoidance schemes is part of good citizenship. So if you become aware of a scheme or suspect you're being asked to participate in one, we encourage you to contact us. Okay. Now, before I move on from our compliance activities, I want to revisit a couple of points I made. I want to be clear that where trustees have committed less serious breaches in their obligations, we work with them to rectify and unwind transactions so that the fund can continue to operate legitimately. But in more serious cases, we take firmer action, including imposing penalties, making funds non-compliant with the loss of their concessional tax treatment, disqualification of trustees, and even prosecution. So in the 2012-13 year, we made 150 funds non-compliant with the consequent loss of their tax concessions. We disqualified 440 people from being a trustee. We wound up 70 funds. And we entered into 513 enforceable undertakings. It might sound like a lot, but you have to remember that's out of around now 509,000 funds. So it's actually only a fairly small number compared to the overall number of SMSFs. Further, we do recognise the impact on people, and that's on people, of those firmer actions. Some of the result in quite a significant loss of the superannuation benefits they have. And that's why we usually prefer to work with trustees to rectify contraventions wherever appropriate and within the constraints of the law. It's also why education is so important. Knowing your obligations is the first step to complying with your obligations. This is why we work with the SMSF profession and trustee organisations to try and ensure knowledgeable professionals and trustees. So what are some of the things we do around that? We publish a lot of things on our website, and because things change, we do encourage you to go there regularly and check out what's changed, what's new. And because things change, we also publish a quarterly newsletter called SMSF News. It currently has over 30,000 subscribers, and it helps you keep up to date with changes. And if something important occurs, we can actually send an update outside of our usual quarterly publication cycle. We do that occasionally. So if you're not a subscriber, I commend it to you. Now we also use our subscribers to that new service as a way to try and learn more about the needs of trustees and the SMSF professionals. We can do focus groups, we can ask them questions, we can do things such as we've been doing recently around we're currently reviewing the annual return. We were able to use that service to tell people we're reviewing it and say, come and tell us about your ideas. We also have, as I mentioned, many publications. We have quite a popular suite of publications around the life cycle of SMSFs. We've recently added a new one there to discuss paying benefits from your super fund. And that means that that life cycle suite now covers events right through from thinking about setting up an SMSF to the end point into paying benefits in the retirement phase. Also, if there's any time spent on the web shows, instructional videos are becoming quite a popular way to tell people about complex issues. I have to admit, I've seen a few fantastic ones out there. There's also a lot of phone and tablet apps around. Even the tax office has actually managed to produce a hit app this year for tax time. Some incredible number of people actually used it. We're very pleased about that. But what that tells us is there's quite a bit of demand for that. So one of the things we're currently looking at, just started looking at, in fact, is producing some videos, maybe even an app or two, that deals with the SMSF side of things. So that's something to, if I dare say it, watch this space. The other thing that we do for trustees and professionals is that you can write to us for advice. You can ask us questions. We can provide written general guidance, which is about the broad operation of the law, and that often gives enough information for many situations. We can also give you advice around your specific situation, your specific SMSF. Now, that advice isn't legally binding, but it does provide some certainty to trustees about the application of the super laws to their fund. And if we later take a view that is different from the advice we gave you, the fact that you've acted in accordance with the advice we gave you is certainly going to be something very much in your favour. Now, if you want to apply for specific advice, the details of how to do that are on our website. You might wonder what people ask us in that kind of advice. So, the most frequently asked questions relate to the following things: acquiring real property from related parties, the conditions for investing in related unit trusts so that they're excluded from the in-house asset rules, what's an improvement or repair of an asset for the limited recourse borrowing arrangement rules, what's an acquisition from a related party for the purposes of those rules, and whether you can use low interest loans. Now, coming back to where I started, we also publish lots of stats. So here's some stats. Go have a look. So, as you can see, we provide quite a range of things, and we're always looking to make improvements. Okay, now I'm going to change topics completely and come back and talk about approved auditors. I mentioned before that approved auditors now have to be registered with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, the ASIC. Currently there's around 7,300 approved auditors registered with ASIC. That's a fair few fewer than there were before auditors were required to register with ASIC. And what that means for trustees or other advisors is make sure that the auditor that you're planning on using is actually registered with ASIC, and make sure of that early, because there's less of them this year. But I'll also say don't get too worried about that, because we're pretty certain that most of the ones who didn't register with ASIC were ones who were doing 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 audits in a year. So there shouldn't be too much of a bottleneck, but just make sure you get in early. So now that we've got this new regime, you must ensure that the auditor you use is registered as an approved SMSF auditor. And you can check that on the ASIC website, not the ATO website. And so approved auditors now have to have an SMSF auditor number, which is issued by ASIC. And you also have to report that number on your annual return to the tax office. And we will be checking that. We'll be checking that you have the number. We'll be checking that it's a correct number. We'll be checking it's a number issued by ASIC. If it doesn't meet any of those things, we'll be rejecting the return. Now, I talked before about the significance of the independent SMSF audit and the important role that approved auditors play in ensuring the integrity of the SMSF sector. And because of that, we will be continuing our compliance focus on the skills of auditors. We will be working closely with ASIC around that, so there's now the 2 of us looking at that. And we have in fact already started working on some cases together where we're concerned about auditors' compliance and competence. And when I say that, we started working on cases, it's only a very small number. Now, our aim is for all approved auditors to understand their obligations and the issues they need to consider when auditing an SMSF. And that's to ensure they do quality audits. To support this aim, we provide the usual range of web and print content for approved auditors, but we also provide some very specialist stuff as well. So, for example, we've updated our guide on the roles and responsibilities of approved auditors, and that guide does exactly what it says and discusses the roles and responsibilities. And it also includes templates to assist in conducting an audit. We've also updated our free audit tool, the Electronic Superannuation Audit Tool, or ESAT. Now this tool is now a primary source of support and assistance for many auditors. ESAT helps auditors ensure they consider all relevant matters when conducting an audit and keep proper records. It also has an extensive reference section covering the various regulatory obligations. ESAT also allows auditors to lodge contravention reports directly with the ATO electronically. Now last quarter, half of all contravention reports were reported to us through ESAT. You can download it free from our website. And if you're an auditor, I'd say go check it out. It's very good. We've also expanded our super professional to professional service for approved auditors. And that's an email-based technical support service. You send us an email with a question, we get back to you quickly. We originally ran it with covering the 100 largest SMSF auditors. We've now expanded that to the top 300. And that covers about 40% of SMSFs. Now, in addition to assisting approved auditors, we also do undertake compliance activities on the approved auditor population. We do things like analyse the trend in contravention reports. We compare the results of our compliance activities on SMSF funds and trustees with the reporting that we get from approved auditors. We also risk assess all approved auditors based on all the data we have based on the SMSF and more general tax side of things, along with other intelligence that we receive. And we use this kind of information to select auditors for detailed investigation. And that can include reviewing a number of the audits they undertook, investigate their processes, documentation, decisions and findings. Now, as for the funds, as I mentioned earlier, we think most auditors try to do the right thing and generally succeed. Again, as for the funds we look at, where we find issues that aren't critical or fraudulent, we focus on providing support, assistance and education. But for critical issues, we'll take firmer action, including referring auditors to ASIC for disciplinary action or disqualification. And the issues that we're most concerned with approved auditors are the following: a lack of independence. We still find SMSF auditors who audit their own or relative funds, as well as auditors who audit funds for which they prepare the accounts and provide advice. That's just not on. We're also concerned about poor quality audit documentation. This kind of fits with my obsession about lodging returns. You've got to have proper documents and records. Now, the reason for that is that allows the ATO and now ASIC to understand the process undertaken by the auditor and the level of detail of the audit. Where auditors can't provide that evidence, or the evidence is incomplete, it does raise concerns with us, now ASIC, about the effectiveness and sometimes the genuineness of an audit. The final concern I'll note is about the auditor's knowledge or familiarity with their own or trustees' obligations. Our experience shows that approved auditors who only undertake a small number of audits may not be as aware as they should be of what obligations they're meant to be auditing. They're therefore more likely to perform ineffective audits. And again, this is where I'll plug ESAT. It helps you very much find, if you're an auditor, the obligations you should be looking at. So again, go check it out. Also, now over the last year or so, our focus with the approved auditor side of things has been on education and support. But from next year, we'll be increasing our compliance focus on approved auditors. We'll be taking advantage of the fact that we now have a registered, known population of auditors. Now, before I move on, there's one more issue of concern to us around the approved audit side of things. One of the things we've been seeing recently is a few offerings of audits at prices that just look way too low. Makes us wonder how on earth you can do a proper audit at that price. Because you certainly couldn't be making a profit. That's what worries us. If you're making a profit at that price, then you're not doing things. That's our concern. We've also seen there's a bit of interest in there about the offshoring of audits. We have very similar concerns with that. Those are two things we'll be looking at quite closely. So that's all I have to say about approved auditors. I'm just going to touch on a few other little points, bits and pieces, before I wrap up. So the first point relates to investment fraud on trustees and their fund accounts. Given the size of the SMSF sector and the value of funds available, as I mentioned, there are over 500 billion and counting, it's a very attractive target for fraud. Investment fraud that we see tends to manifest in two ways. First way is that fraudsters target SMSF trustees, encouraging them to make poor quality or fraudulent investments. We've seen quite a few such instances. We're actually quite concerned by the success that fraudsters have and continue to have here. Even the most experienced and financially literate trustees have lost their money. So it's not just people who don't know what they're doing. Some of the fraudsters are very clever. And the other approach we've seen is to persuade SMSF trustees to assign control of their bank accounts or investments to a third party who is ostensibly assisting them. These third parties then use the access either to invest in assets that just don't exist, or sometimes just to siphon the money off directly. Once again, it's actually quite worrying how successful people are at this. Now, this type of fraud tends to target those who are a little less sophisticated, but again, not always. Now, I just mention this to make sure that you are aware of the potential for fraud and that you keep it in mind when considering investment options. And of course, I've only talked in quite vague generalities there, but those aren't just the only ways fraud can be done. Just keep it in mind. Now, the other thing I'd also like to note is the continued and very considerable interest in the limited recourse borrowing arrangements. We're working closely with the SMSF sector to ensure that the arrangements entered into comply with the law. Now, I encourage you to familiarise yourself, if you haven't already, with our taxpayer alert 2012/7. Now, it talks about the kind of care you need to exercise and what kind of arrangements are out there, and the use in particular of related unit trusts. The other thing I also encourage you to do is to check the rules first before you consider acquiring an asset under one of these arrangements, because the arrangements have to be set up exactly right to be legal. Don't wait to check the rules until after you've bought the asset, because that can be way too late. Now, while we're on the subject, there's also been much recent attention given to purchasing property through SMSFs, and particularly gearing. All I'm going to add to that topic today is to repeat what I just said about making sure you set up the arrangements correctly, and to say, be cautious. Watch out for property spruikers. Take the time to make sure the property is the right investment for you and your fund. Make sure it fits with your existing investment strategy. That assumes you've got an investment strategy. You need to have an investment strategy. Have an investment strategy. And if it doesn't fit with your existing investment strategy, take the time to revisit your investment strategy properly before deciding whether to buy the property. Don't get caught up in the moment. Been hearing from various advisors about the problems they run into when a client turns up on Monday morning and says, I bought this property on the weekend, wanted to my SMSF. It's too late. Okay, moving on. So, in April, ASIC released their report on improving the quality of advice given to SMSFs. In general, they found that the majority of advice provided was adequate, but not good. They said there was room for improvement in various aspects of the process of advice giving, particularly advice involving recommendations that investors set up SMSFs to gear into real property. The bottom line is, if you're considering limited recourse borrowing arrangement, don't underestimate the complexity. Now, ASIC has also recently released their consultation paper with proposals to impose specific disclosure obligations on advisors. The paper also discusses running costs and viable asset size for SMSFs, with a report that ASIC commissioned from the actuary Trice Warner. If you're an SMSF professional, I recommend you go to ASIC's website and read the consultation paper if you haven't already. It will affect you. The second last topic I'd like to just mention briefly is that we have recently released our taxation ruling 2013/5, which is about when superannuation income stream commences and ceases. And there's also been the new regulations on that point that came into effect on the 4th of June. The new regulations allow the income tax exemption for earnings that support pensions to continue after the death of a member who was in the pension phase until the deceased member's benefits are paid out. So death benefits will still be required to be paid out as soon as practicable after the death, and funds will not be able to keep benefits in the tax-free pension environment indefinitely, but it does give you time. Now, the last thing I'd like to know relates to the increasing number of funds in pension phase. This is a factor of the general increasing age of the population. For many funds, trustees may reach the point where they no longer have sufficient capacity to manage their SMSF. I encourage trustees, if you haven't done so already, to think about what you want to happen if that happens, and to set things up the way you want them before that point's reached. Again, it's too late if you haven't done it beforehand. And for SMSF professionals, if you don't already, I encourage you to encourage your clients to think about that and set things up sooner rather than later. Again, it's too late if you don't think about it early enough. So, I started this talk by looking at some statistics around the growth in the number of SMSFs, the number of members of SMSFs, and the amount of assets managed through SMSFs. I noted that the figures, including this growth, generally paint a picture of a sector in good health. A robust, growing SMSF sector is a good result. But also, growing numbers means more vigilance, not less vigilance, from us and from SMSF professionals and trustees to ensure the continuing health of the sector. And that continuing health and being able to demonstrate it are important factors in being able to ensure that SMSFs continue to enjoy their reputation as a safe and appropriate place in which to entrust the retirement savings of a growing number of Australians. It is up to all of us, the ATO, the SMSF profession and SMSF trustees, to work together to ensure that continues to be the case. Thank you.